Our next speaker is, I just want to add one point. If there are seats available in the middle of your row, please move in. We have some folks who went to the lower school by mistake and are arriving, and it's hard for them to get past the camera. So folks on this side, you can move in a little bit and free up some seats. That would be great. We're actually ahead of time on the schedule. Hilary Krieger is the Washington bureau chief for the Jerusalem Post. Hilary writes about the White House, State Department, Pentagon, and congressional policy on Israel, the wider Middle East, and the Jewish community. She moved back to the United States in 2006 after spending 5 years in Israel, where she worked for the Jerusalem Post and the Marketplace radio program broadcast on NPR. She has also appeared frequently in the national and international media as an analyst, and she has interviewed world leaders and cultural icons, reporting from bomb shelters in the Siberian hinterlands and having traveled to more than 40 countries in 40 states and lived in 5 capital cities. It's my pleasure, and please let's give a warm welcome to Hilary Krieger.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be part of this panel. I wanted to start by making something of a radical statement, which is that, in my opinion, I don't think that Israel is absolutely terrible when it comes to PR, and I don't think that the American media is irredeemably anti-Israel. Now, I think Yoni helped me make the first point, but there are still some shortcomings with Israeli PR, which I'll be mentioning, and there are times when the American media is biased, which I'll also be addressing. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that the overall Israeli PR landscape is very mixed. And there are actually some positive points it's really important to hold on to as you're thinking about Israel as a state. So for one thing, Israel has excellent spokesmen representing it at embassies around the world and in many parts of the government. And I'm not just saying that because Yoni's sitting in front of me, and I'm hoping that on Monday he's still going to be talking to me and telling me what's going on at the embassy so I can write about it. I think what Yoni and the ambassador, Michael Oren, simply demonstrate is the high quality and attention that Israel is giving to who represents it. And this wasn't always the case. I remember not that long ago, in fact during the depths of the Intifada, Ariel Sharon appointed an ambassador to Britain who didn't quite speak English, which is a slight problem. And at the Jerusalem Post, we wanted to interview him, and we wanted to do it in English, or an English language paper, and he actually refused to do an interview in English because he was so uncomfortable speaking English. Since then, however, things have really changed, and Israel has now had 2 prime ministers who really understand the importance of speaking effectively on behalf of Israel, and who themselves speak excellent English and do advocate and use those skills on Israel's behalf. Also, the foreign ministry has started to think very seriously and very strategically about Israel's image, most significantly with a project called Brand Israel, which tries to think of ways to go beyond the conflict, introduce the broader international community to Israel's beautiful beaches and its great history and all the wonderful things you see if you actually go and visit Israel. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't some self-imposed challenges. Chief among them, the lack of priority that can be given to Hasbara, to public relations, as demonstrated by the relatively small budget the Foreign Ministry has for it. A few years ago, Foreign Ministry officials like to say that the few $1 million they received was something less than the annual budget for advertising for Bamba, which, if you're not familiar with Bamba, it's this Israeli junk food that's like a cheese puff, but tastes like peanut butter. It's inexplicable to me, but it's really popular in Israel. So if you have a lack of resources, obviously you're not going to be as effective in getting the message out, though the ministry is aware of that and has been increasing budgets recently. Also, in Israel, and it's particularly challenging within the IDF, there can be a lack of understanding that the media war is as important to win as the military war. Now, when there's military confrontation going on and lives are at stake, this can be a very understandable decision. But there are a lot of times when Israel could do more to make sure that it's playing a role in shaping the message. So one time, right after the Lebanon War, I was writing a story about a Human Rights Watch report that was detailing what the IDF had done in southern Lebanon. And it was very critical of the IDF. So I called up the spokesman of the army and I said, I wanted to get a response because I wanted to include it in my story. And they said, oh, we're not responding to that report. We don't want to legitimize it with our perspective. And I said, well, okay, you might not want to, but I want to include both sides in my story. So I kept on bugging them and bugging them. Finally, late at night, right before my deadline, I finally get a call back. And the spokesman says, okay, I'll talk to you about the story, but you're the only journalist I'm going to speak to because I trust that the Jerusalem Post will be fair to the IDF. So I thought, well, that's good for my story. I'll have both sides. But meanwhile, CNN, Reuters, AP, fair or not, they have a story going all around the world that only has the Human Rights Watch perspective. So obviously there are places where there can be some improvements, but I still maintain that the Israel PR situation isn't all bad, and that's partly because, in addition to the excellent professional spokespeople that Israel has, Israel also has the most active and sizable and formative group of advocates for any issue on either side of the Atlantic. You. I don't know of any other group of people that's as involved and motivated as the American Jewish community and Israel's Christian allies, whether it's writing letters to the editor or showing up at rallies or being involved in the political process. And that means that anything that Israel invests in public relations gets multiplied many, many times over by whatever it is people are doing here. And that really has an effect on how Israel is perceived in America. And by and large, that perception is very positive. Yoni mentioned poll numbers that show that. So just to give you a couple of examples, a Gallup poll this month found that 68% of Americans view Israel positively. Israel Project poll found that American support for Israel versus Palestinians was 55 to 6. And other polls have shown that Israel is one of the very few number of countries that Americans say they would be willing to defend by force. So all of this suggests that Israel's message and image here isn't absolutely atrocious. I'd also say, again, a little bit of a radical statement here, but I think that the American media, and I would distinguish it from the European media, but by and large, the American media does a decent job of covering Israel. First of all, it's important to keep in mind the broad American media landscape and where Americans are getting their news. So the #1 circulation paper in the country is the Wall Street Journal. It actually has about twice as many subscribers as the New York Times. The biggest source for cable news is Fox News. Rush Limbaugh has about as many listeners as NPR. That's not to mention blogs or podcasts or tweets or whatever multiplying sources of information the American public audience is getting its news from. I also think it's very important to keep in mind that this is an incredibly complicated conflict. The events change. It's almost impossible to keep up with the fast-breaking pace, and there are incredible sensitivities on all sides of this issue. And despite that, day in and day out, American reporters are doing a solid job of reporting stories on what's happening and even writing, very often, stories that are positive about Israel. Just Friday, the New York Times had a story about the Chilean miners who were visiting Israel. And the week before that, the Washington Post had an entire editorial criticizing Mahmoud Abbas as being intransigent on the peace process. And I can go on and on. Now, these stories don't tend to get as much attention as negative stories from the pro-Israel community, which makes sense. But I think it's important when people do focus on problematic stories to think about the broader context and realize that that's the exception and not the rule. When it comes to the problematic stories, I also think that has mostly to do with the inherent difficulties and challenges of reporting on this conflict and not anti-Israel sentiment. So, for instance, reporters never have enough time to get as much information as they'd like because of the fast-breaking nature of things. Reporters also don't ever have enough space to give the full context. You just don't have 100 words in every story to give what happened before, and that can mean missing out on important nuance and details. And reporters and editors with this story, as with every story, want to be able to have a clear, simple storyline so that readers can have some way of understanding a very complicated situation. And they want one that has good headlines and strong leads. And then there's the image of the conflict itself. When you have a situation where you're having an Israeli tank on one side and a Palestinian teenager with a rock on the other, whoever's taking that picture is going to have an image that doesn't look so good for Israel, but it's just a reality of the conflict. And then there's the content itself. In many of these most controversial cases, Israel is starting from a position that's often not where many people in the West are starting from, whether it's on settlements or the Israeli civilian casualty rate or reacting to the situation in Egypt, which Rob detailed for us. So for instance, for your average American looking at what was happening in Egypt, there's concern about who might come after Mubarak. Obviously, people don't want to see Islamic fundamentalism. But the gut reaction of most Americans was, wow, this is people calling for freedom and democracy. These are our values, and this is a real exciting opportunity. Now in Israel, instead of hearing, we love democracy and freedom too, and we hope this works out well, and here are our very valid and real security issues, the dominant message was, Mubarak's not so bad, he's done some good stuff, and stability is the most important thing. Now, Israel can have very good reasons for feeling that way. But when Israel's coming from that perspective, there should be an awareness that that's just not necessarily where your average person from the West is coming. And so it's important for Israel's defenders to understand that dynamic. Now, I do think that there are cases when there is outright bias against Israel. One of the reasons for that can be because Israel is perceived as part of the West, which is something that Israel itself wants. But that means that it can be held to a different standard. So in the situation with Egypt, Arab states were saying very much the same thing about their concerns about Mubarak, and the reporting on that was very straightforward. This is what Arabs think. It was really only with Israel that you saw criticism of those perspectives. Also, Israel can be seen in many cases as the Goliath to the Palestinian David, which gets back to the sort of simple storylines, the images of the conflict, and that can definitely color how reporters and editors report on what's happening on the ground. So most often are holding Israel accountable when there's impediments in the peace process, or disproportionately focusing on settlements rather than incitement or other things that Palestinians do. One of the biggest challenges with this bias is that reporters are often not aware that they have it. But reporters are human, so they have opinions and biases like anybody else, and being professional means being aware of those biases so you can try and overcome them. I know what my heritage is, I know where my sympathies tend to lie, so I try to be careful when I'm reporting to say, okay, how would somebody from a different perspective see this? Whose voice do I need to include that's not being heard? And unfortunately, a lot of reporters in Israel and reporters here in Washington think that because they're not Israeli or because they're not Palestinian, therefore they have no biases. And that's simply not the case. I remember being at a panel in Jerusalem with a number of foreign correspondents, and somebody in the audience asked a prominent American journalist, who I'm not going to name, but they asked him whether the fact that he was Jewish had any effect on his reporting. And he answered, instantaneously, no. And I thought, really? Not even a little? And it doesn't in any way color the lens through which you see this conflict? And a couple of years later, I happened to run into him here in Washington. He'd just come back from Washington, and we were catching up. And he said to me, oh, I'm so glad to be out of Israel. I just couldn't take it anymore. The Israelis, are treating the Palestinians terribly, and the settlements are expanding, and they're destroying any hope for peace, and on and on. And I thought, okay, those are legitimate views. A lot of people have them. But your job as a reporter is to be reporting on other people with those and differing views, not to be indulging in expressing those views yourself. Now, having said that, I do believe that most reporters are professional, they're careful, thoughtful, and want to get things right, which means they're also responsive to feedback. Just like governments are accountable to their voters, media outlets are accountable to their constituents, readers. So I would encourage you all to remain an active and involved citizenry, whether it's writing letters, talkbacks on websites, telling members of the media what you think. Please keep doing it, and most importantly, please keep reading newspapers, especially the Jerusalem Post. Thank you.